There is a car that has carried vaccines into places with no roads, delivered food across deserts with no names on any map, been used by doctors in refugee camps, by scientists in the Australian Outback, by relief workers racing toward disasters that the rest of the world had already forgotten. It has also been used in wars, by armies, by insurgents, by forces on every side of every line. One conflict in Africa was named after it, not after the nation, not after the leader, after the car. The Toyota Land Cruiser did not start as a symbol of anything. It started as a solution to a very specific problem in post-war Japan. A country trying to survive, a company that nearly went bankrupt, and a vehicle nobody originally wanted. What followed was one of the strangest transformations in automotive history. A machine built to answer the demands of a police reserve force in 1951 would become, over the following 7 decades, something no engineer in Tokyo ever sat down to design. It became the car that the world sends when the world runs out of options. This is the story of how that happened. In the summer of 1945, Japan's industrial economy had been destroyed. Cities were rubble. Factories were gone. Toyota Motor Company, which had spent the war years building military trucks for the Imperial Japanese Army, emerged from the conflict with fewer than 3,000 employees and almost no functioning facilities. The company tried to rebuild. It designed a new passenger car in 1947, but the Japanese economy kept contracting. By 1949, inflation had made raw materials nearly impossible to source. Urban families were trading clothing for food. When the government introduced emergency anti-inflation measures that year, consumer demand collapsed almost overnight. Toyota could not make payroll. A bitter labor dispute followed. The workforce was cut from 8,000 to 6,000. The company came within reach of bankruptcy. Then, in June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and everything changed. The Korean War transformed Japan's economic position almost immediately. American forces already occupied Japan, and suddenly the country was not just a defeated nation under reconstruction. It was a logistical staging ground for a major military conflict happening 200 miles across the water. The United States government needed supplies. It needed trucks. It needed vehicles. And it needed them fast and from nearby. Toyota received orders for military trucks. Production restarted. The company that had nearly dissolved began to find its footing again. But the Korean War created a second, less obvious opportunity. American commanders in Japan ordered the establishment of a Japanese National Police Reserve, a domestic security force that would carry out internal order while American troops focused on Korea. That force needed vehicles, capable vehicles, four-wheel drive vehicles, the kind of vehicle that didn't yet exist in Japan in any form a local manufacturer could build at scale. The Americans asked Japan's car manufacturers to develop a compact four-wheel drive truck. Toyota accepted the challenge. Working quickly, using experience from wartime truck production and whatever parts could be sourced from existing models, Toyota's engineers completed a prototype in January 1951. The development had taken roughly 5 months. The vehicle was boxy, utilitarian, and unadorned. It looked, deliberately and unavoidably, like a Jeep. That was not accidental. The Willys Jeep had proven itself as one of the most capable off-road vehicles ever built, and every manufacturer in the world looking to enter that space was studying it carefully. Toyota's engineers were not trying to reinvent anything. They were trying to build something that worked, quickly, from what they had. The prototype used a 3.4-liter 6-cylinder engine producing around 85 horsepower, more powerful than the original Willys Jeep. It was larger, heavier, and considerably more capable on steep terrain. They called it the Toyota Jeep BJ. In July 1951, Toyota's test driver Ichiro Taira climbed into the BJ prototype and drove it to the 6th checkpoint of Mount Fuji, 12,000 feet above sea level. No motor vehicle had ever reached that point on the mountain. Observers from Japan's National Police Agency watched the demonstration. The vehicle had performed under conditions that could strand any ordinary machine. The police agency placed an order. Government forestry departments followed. In total, around 1,300 of the early BJ models were built. For a company that had recently been negotiating around bankruptcy, those were numbers that mattered. But Toyota had not won the police contract it originally wanted. The National Police Reserve Force had ended up choosing a Mitsubishi vehicle for its main fleet. Toyota's BJ had proven its capability and then been passed over for the primary order. The company was left with a functional, proven vehicle and a partial market. What it did next with that situation would define the next 70 years. Toyota decided to stop thinking of the BJ as a police vehicle and start thinking of it as an export. In the post-war period, Japan's industrial policy was built around a simple survival principle. Factories had to sell abroad. The country had no meaningful domestic consumer market for large vehicles. It had no significant oil reserves of its own. Every resource it needed to build things had to be paid for with foreign currency, which could only be earned by selling things to other countries. The phrase used at the time was blunt and accurate: export or perish. Toyota understood that the Land Rover, Britain's own rugged four-wheel drive utility vehicle that had emerged in 1948, was finding customers across the world. Farmers in Australia, mining operations in Africa, government agencies in the Middle East. There was a global market for a vehicle that could go where roads didn't, carry loads that ordinary trucks couldn't, and run for years in conditions that would destroy a standard sedan. Toyota had a vehicle that could do all of those things. It just needed a name. In 1954, Willys Overland Motors in the United States sent Toyota a cease and desist letter. Jeep was a registered trademark. Toyota couldn't keep calling its four-wheel drive truck the Toyota Jeep. The company's technical director, Hanji Umehara, was tasked with finding a new name. He later said he didn't want Toyota's vehicle to sound less dignified than its competitors. There was already a Land Rover. He chose the name Land Cruiser. In June 1954, the Toyota Land Cruiser was born, not through a dramatic engineering breakthrough, not through a bold vision statement, but through a legal threat and a search for something that sounded appropriately serious. That same year, Toyota began redesigning the vehicle for civilian export. The strictly military appearance was softened. Doors were added. A metal roof arrived. By 1955, a version was available with roll-down windows and, remarkably for the period, optional air conditioning. These were not the priorities of a vehicle being built for police forces. These were the priorities of a manufacturer trying to sell cars to farmers, business people, and anyone else in the world who needed to go somewhere that required four-wheel drive. If you are watching this on a TV, which most of you are, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. It genuinely matters for the future of this channel. And if this story is the kind of thing you find yourself wanting to share, please do. Getting more people to discover these histories is what keeps this going. Toyota's export ambitions were documented in a company strategy that became known internally as the Land Cruiser strategy. The vehicle was not merely a product to be sold. It was meant to be the point vehicle, the machine that entered a new market first, proved Toyota's reliability under extreme conditions, and opened the door for everything else the company wanted to sell. Passenger cars, sedans, compact vehicles, all of those would follow the Land Cruiser into new countries. But the Land Cruiser went first because it went places ordinary vehicles couldn't. In 1955, Toyota exported 98 Land Cruisers to 14 countries. The following year, that number grew to 518 vehicles in 35 countries. By 1957, just 2 years later, Toyota was shipping 2,502 Land Cruisers to 47 countries. These were not enormous numbers by the standards of mass automotive production, but they were happening in places where no Japanese car had ever been sold. In Burma, the first exports came as part of Japan's war reparations. Land Cruisers sent to a country Japan had occupied, as part of a diplomatic settlement. In Australia, the first 12 Land Cruisers arrived in August 1957. Australia would eventually become the Land Cruiser's largest single market on Earth. But in 1957, the vehicle was barely known there, and Australian trade policies made importing it extremely difficult. The real breakthrough would come later, in a way that no marketing campaign could have manufactured, through the vehicle simply being used in conditions that destroyed everything else. The 1960 FJ40 is the Land Cruiser most people picture when they close their eyes and think of the name. The two-door short wheelbase version with its boxy steel body, removable hardtop, and solid axles at both ends. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't sophisticated. It had a 2-speed transfer case for serious off-road work, a rugged ladder frame chassis, and an inline-6 engine that produced around 125 horsepower and 200 pounds of torque. On a paved road, it was slow and loud. On a dirt track in Queensland or a mountain pass in Iran or game trail in East Africa, it was something different entirely. The FJ40 came to the United States in 1960 and was Toyota's best-selling vehicle there through 1965. In Australia, the distributor Thies Brothers had established 22 dealerships across Queensland by 1960 and launched a major marketing campaign around the new model. The logic was simple. The FJ40 was aimed at the vast, arid interior of Australia's cattle and sheep country. The outback properties so remote that supply runs had to be planned for days, where a vehicle breakdown didn't mean waiting for a tow truck, but potentially waiting for days before anyone came past. In those conditions, the question of which vehicle to trust was not abstract. The Land Cruiser's reputation in Australia was built project by project, property by property. Its use in major construction projects, including the Bass Strait to Melbourne gas pipeline, gave it a documented track record in industrial conditions. Scientists from Australia's Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation used FJ45 station wagons on long expeditions through remote Arnhem Land. The Australian expression that grew from that era is still repeated. If you want to drive into the outback, take a Land Rover. But if you want to get back out again, you'll need a Land Cruiser. As a description of comparative reliability in genuinely demanding terrain, that phrase did more for Toyota's reputation than any advertisement the company could have paid for. By 1984, the millionth Land Cruiser had rolled off the production line. Australia alone had absorbed a significant proportion of the global total. A vehicle that Toyota had begun exporting as a diplomatic reparation payment and a beachhead strategy had become the defining four-wheel drive machine on an entire continent. But the story was changing in other places too, in ways that had nothing to do with farming or construction. The Middle East had begun importing Land Cruisers in significant numbers through the late 1950s and 1960s. The logic there was partly geographic. The Arabian Peninsula has vast stretches of desert where roads were still rare, and where a vehicle's ability to navigate sand and extreme heat without mechanical failure was not a preference but a necessity. Oil company field operations required vehicles that could reach remote drilling sites and survive months of continuous use in temperatures that regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Government survey teams needed the same thing. The Land Cruiser kept arriving. Some of the earliest Land Cruiser 40 series models built in the 1960s are still working in the United Arab Emirates, not as collector items, as working vehicles. A fishing village in the UAE documented by Toyota's own newsroom still uses a 40 series that has been running for more than 50 years. That is not a story about exceptional maintenance. That is a story about a vehicle designed with simplicity so fundamental that it can be kept running with basic tools, mechanical knowledge, and determination, long after the manufacturer has stopped making parts for it. That quality, that almost unreasonable durability, was not something Toyota had specifically advertised. It was something the vehicle had proven in places where proving it was a matter of survival. And as that reputation spread, the Land Cruiser started moving into territories far beyond the original vision of any Toyota executive or export strategist. The United Nations began using Land Cruisers in field operations across Africa and Asia in the 1960s and 1970s. Aid organizations followed. Medical teams from Médecins Sans Frontières deployed them in conflict zones and epidemic response areas. The World Health Organization used them to reach remote communities for vaccination campaigns. The vehicle's combination of off-road capability, relative mechanical simplicity, and proven long-term reliability made it the logical choice for work in environments where logistics were complicated and parts were scarce. Eventually, Toyota responded to this specialized demand by creating a dedicated supply structure. A little-known subsidiary called Toyota Gibraltar Stock Holdings was established to build and deliver customized Land Cruisers specifically for NGOs, United Nations agencies, and international relief organizations. Working from Gibraltar, which offered both logistical advantages and a stable regulatory environment, the facility was shipping approximately 650 white Toyota vehicles per month to conflict zones, disaster regions, and remote areas around the world. UNICEF included Land Cruisers in its official supply catalog, available for procurement by member organizations. When Japan's government contributed emergency vehicles to Nigerian communities displaced by flooding through the United Nations Office for Project Services, Land Cruisers were in the shipment. The white Land Cruiser with the UN or NGO logo became as recognizable in certain parts of the world as the Red Cross itself. In Burundi, Land Cruisers carried patients with malaria to hospitals in areas with no paved roads. In Uganda, they transported patients from refugee camps to clinics. In Costa Rica's highland agricultural regions, farmers working at altitudes of 3,500 meters on slopes too steep for ordinary machinery used Land Cruisers as farming equipment, the only vehicle capable of reaching fields that humans themselves struggle to stand on. Toyota documented these uses not as marketing but as operational records. The company's official newsroom stated plainly that there are places in the world where daily life would be impossible without the Land Cruiser. That is not promotional language. It is logistical reality, confirmed by the organizations operating in those environments. And then came the war. In 1983, Libya's leader Muammar Gaddafi sent military forces into northern Chad. The conflict was rooted in a long-standing territorial dispute over the Aouzou Strip along the Chad-Libya border, and in Gaddafi's refusal to accept the legitimacy of Chadian President Hissène Habré. Libya was a regional power flush with oil wealth, equipped with Soviet-made tanks, artillery, multiple rocket launchers, and combat aircraft. Chad was a landlocked country among the world's poorest, with a small, irregular military and limited access to sophisticated weapons. What Chad did have was mobility. Chadian forces under the command of skilled battlefield leaders including Idriss Déby and Hassan Jamous developed a strategy built entirely around speed. Their primary weapons platform was the Toyota Land Cruiser and its smaller sibling, the Hilux pickup. These vehicles, fitted with anti-tank missile systems and heavy machine guns and called technicals, could cross the Sahara Desert at speeds and across terrain that made them nearly impossible to pin down. They didn't try to hold fixed positions. They struck Libyan formations and vanished into the desert before aircraft could respond. They destroyed equipment and disappeared. In early 1987, French forces provided around 400 Toyota pickups equipped with Milan anti-tank guided missiles to Chadian forces, which dramatically increased their ability to destroy Libyan armored vehicles. The Battle of Fada in January 1987 became a turning point. Chadian technicals executed a rapid strike against Libyan positions, capturing equipment and routing a conventionally superior force. The outcome of the war was decisive. Libya lost an estimated 1/10 of its entire army, approximately 7,500 soldiers killed, and around $1.5 billion worth of military equipment either destroyed or captured. Chadian forces suffered approximately 1,000 deaths. Gaddafi's expansionist ambitions in the region were fundamentally damaged. Military analysts and journalists, struggling to describe what had happened, settled on a name for the conflict. They didn't call it the Chadian War. They didn't call it the Habré Offensive. They called it the Toyota War. And the name stuck because it captured something true. A Japanese commercial vehicle had become the decisive instrument of a military victory in the Sahara Desert. Gaddafi's Soviet-made T-55 tanks, some of the most recognizable pieces of Cold War military hardware in the world, had been outmaneuvered and destroyed by a civilian automobile originally designed for export to farmers. A quote attributed to Chadian fighters, impossible to verify precisely but reported across multiple accounts, captured the sentiment: "We know that it is better to have a good Toyota than a T-55." Toyota was not pleased. The company had built the Land Cruiser for farmers and aid workers and government agencies. It had built the vehicle's reputation on reliability and durability in service of peaceful civilian purposes. The Toyota War was not a story Toyota chose to tell about itself, but it was a story about a vehicle that had proven so mechanically suited to its environment, so dependable, so simple to maintain, so capable across difficult terrain, that every party with limited resources and maximum need reached for it. That paradox would become one of the defining complications of the Land Cruiser's global reputation. The same vehicle that carried vaccines into villages without roads was also being mounted with heavy weapons in conflicts across Africa, the Middle East, and Afghanistan. The qualities that made it valuable to Médecins Sans Frontières made it equally valuable to the groups those doctors were trying to work around. Reliability doesn't choose sides. The US government was sufficiently concerned about this in 2014 when Toyota Land Cruisers and Hilux trucks appeared in large numbers in ISIS propaganda videos in Iraq and Syria and Libya, that American officials formally asked Toyota to explain where the vehicles were coming from. The company noted that it had no control over secondary markets and had strict policies against knowingly selling to armed groups. But the vehicles were already out there in vast numbers because they had been out there for decades, spreading through second-hand markets and aid organization fleets and government disposal programs. There was no mechanism in the world capable of concentrating that many reliable vehicles in the world's most difficult regions and then controlling what happened to them afterward. The Land Cruiser had escaped its origins more completely than almost any vehicle in automotive history. By the time the millionth Land Cruiser was sold in Australia in the summer of 2019, the chosen location because Australia remained its largest single national market, the vehicle had accumulated a history that no automotive executive could have designed, no marketing team could have manufactured, and no documentary could fully contain. It had been a post-war police prototype rejected by the force it was designed for. It had been named after a legal dispute over trademark rights. It had been sold to Burma as a diplomatic reparation. It had been used to build gas pipelines in Australia, to reach malaria patients in Burundi, to survey insects in Arnhem Land, to harvest carrots on Costa Rican mountain slopes too steep for humans to stand on. It had won a war in the Sahara. It had carried humanitarian workers into disasters that the world had already stopped watching. It had been photographed on every continent and in practically every conflict of the last 4 decades. Toyota sells the Land Cruiser in approximately 170 countries and regions. In 2018, roughly 400,000 units were sold in a single year. The 70 series, which replaced the FJ40 in 1984 and was itself designed purely for heavy-duty work with no concessions to fashion or comfort, is still in production in some markets today, more than 4 decades after its introduction. 40 series Land Cruisers from the 1960s and 1970s are still working vehicles in places from the UAE to the Australian Outback. They are not museum pieces. They are being used because nothing has replaced them in the specific ecological niche they occupy. Remote terrain, limited infrastructure, long distances, and no margin for mechanical failure. The Land Cruiser's later generations moved in a different direction. The 80 series, introduced in 1990 at the height of Japan's economic boom, brought genuine luxury to the nameplate. The 100 series and 200 series pushed further into premium territory. In the United States, where the vehicle is sold as a Lexus LX, it sits at the top of a luxury SUV category, with a price tag far beyond anything its original buyers in Queensland's cattle country would have imagined. The machine that Australian farmers chose because it was more reliable than a Land Rover on difficult terrain is now also a prestige object in cities where the most demanding driving condition is a parking structure. That transformation has its own irony. The vehicle that became famous because it refused to fail in the world's harshest conditions is now sold as an aspirational status symbol in places where the harshest condition it will likely encounter is a poorly maintained airport access road. But there is something the luxury versions cannot entirely erase, because it lives in the vehicle's structure rather than its marketing. The Land Cruiser 70 series still looks almost exactly like a working machine. The 300 series and its equivalents carry the same fundamental design logic. A body-on-frame chassis, an emphasis on durability over weight reduction, a powertrain built for longevity rather than peak performance figures, that connects them to the BJ prototype that Ichiro Taira drove up Mount Fuji in July 1951. That lineage is not incidental. Toyota has repeatedly chosen to preserve the basic architecture of the Land Cruiser when market pressure or design fashion might have pushed in a different direction. The reason offered, internally and externally, has remained consistent. The vehicle has users in places where any compromise on durability could have consequences that go beyond inconvenience. There is a standard in automotive history for vehicles that became more than their creators intended. The Jeep left the military and became an American civilian icon. The Land Rover left British farms and became a symbol of status in cities it was never designed to serve. The Land Cruiser did something slightly different. It became many things simultaneously, in many places at once, for many groups who had entirely different relationships with what the vehicle meant. In the Australian Outback, it was practical infrastructure. In the UN's white vehicle fleets, it was humanitarian reach. In the Sahara, in 1987, it was a military doctrine. In Tokyo showrooms, it became aspirational luxury. The engineers who worked on the BJ prototype in January 1951, racing to complete a vehicle in 5 months using existing parts because a newly forming Japanese police force needed something quickly, were solving an immediate, local, bureaucratic problem. They were not designing the vehicle that aid organizations would depend on to reach disaster survivors in places that roads had never reached. They were not designing the vehicle that would give its name to a war. They were not designing an object that collectors would pay extraordinary prices for in London auction rooms 70 years later. They were building something that worked, in conditions that were difficult, quickly, from what was available. That commitment to functional durability, built not from idealism, but from necessity, not from vision, but from constraint, turned out to be exactly what large parts of the world most needed from an automobile. And the world found it, in ways and places that no one in Toyota's engineering department ever planned. Today, when you see a Toyota Land Cruiser, whether it is carrying supplies through a region that hasn't yet made the news, or sitting polished and pristine in a city dealership surrounded by other expensive machines, you are looking at something that carries more accumulated history than almost any other vehicle on Earth. Not the history of racing victories or design revolutions or famous owners. The history of places where the alternative to a functioning vehicle was not inconvenience, but genuine crisis. The history of terrain that destroyed other machines. The history of wars, of epidemics, of floods, of remote deserts and mountains without roads, of situations where the only thing between a person and total isolation was the question of whether the vehicle would start. It started, reliably, repeatedly, in more difficult conditions than any automotive engineer in post-war Japan could have imagined they were designing for. That is the Toyota Land Cruiser, not the car of the adventurous weekend driver, not the car of the wealthy city buyer, not the car of the collectors and the auction catalogs, though it became all of those things. The car of the world's harshest places, because the world's harshest places found it and kept it running. The Land Cruiser's story is inseparable from another truth about reliable machines in extreme conditions, that what the world depends on, the world rarely forgets. Another vehicle earned a similar kind of loyalty in an entirely different set of circumstances. A British farmer, standing in a post-war field with a piece of aluminum and a borrowed American Jeep, made a decision that would define British off-road history for the next 7 decades. That story is the Land Rover, and we've already told it.